All right. So, since we are in the middle of Lent right now, I want to answer a few questions that I've received in my life that I hear people talking about. That sort of the the person walking down the street, whether they're Catholic or Christian or a non-believer or questioning, a lot of people have a lot of the same questions around the crucifixion and around Jesus' sacrifice. And I'm going to try my best today to answer some of the common questions that we have on in how the sacrifice saves us, how that functionally saves us. I think that can confuse a lot of people. And I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not going to be able to give a perfect explanation. I don't think any person on the planet is capable of giving a perfect explanation because that's part of the mystery of faith in that God is so big and broad and operates at a level so high, so much further above what we could possibly operate at, that it wouldn't even make sense for us to fully understand how like these spiritual concepts work. And so I'm gonna try to ease some questioning maybe, or try to like spark some more debate or some more discussion. I think that's very important, and like how I tackle these things. So let's talk about that today. So first, in order to understand Jesus' sacrifice and our relationship with him, we first need to understand how sin separates us from God, because that's what happened at original sin. Is humanity essentially was separated from God, and it's left sort of an indelible mark on us as a group, as a species, and that from that point on, we've continued to fall in many ways further and further away, and we are a fallen creation, and that's what the Old Testament describes. That's what the book of Genesis describes. Is after original sin, Cain kills Abel. We go into the pre-flood society where humanity becomes very bad. Human sacrifice and worshiping pagan gods and just being just morally not very good. And God, of course, wipes the slate clean. But even the flood doesn't keep us from sin. We continue to fall back into sin, and that's just part of our nature. And so what has to happen is, God is perfectly holy. He is without sin. And when we sin, it separates us from God. So that's the first concept we need to understand, is that since the fall of man, since the disobedience of Adam and Eve, we have fallen away from God. And to understand God's nature is, God seeks justice, and we can find clues in our own nature, right? All of us at some level seek and want justice for everything. We want justice, we want fairness, we want a balance. We're always searching for this balance in life, whether it's when we're talking about good, evil, light, darkness, work-life balance, like all these concepts we have in our life, is like all of us are striving to find a balance. And certain actions need to be taken to achieve that. And it's very difficult. So this is why God, as sort of a spiritual figure, is there needs to be some sort of action taken to help save us, to help bring us out of this. And one scenario that plays out through the Old Testament is the Old Testament tells us that sin requires sacrifice to try and repair that relationship. So the Old Testament talks about sacrifice, which used to be in animals like lambs and bulls and goats, and that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Like, what is God getting at? Why does God want to see this pain and destruction? And it's an atonement. It's one of the most difficult questions to answer, but ultimately Jesus' sacrifice removes the need for any of that, for any of these offerings to be made to God. And so that's what makes it interesting. That's why Jesus is called the Lamb, is he becomes the perfect. He comes down and becomes the perfect sacrifice because he is pure. He is both fully God and fully human. And so he's the only, obviously no human has ever been like him. And he lives a sin-free life for 33 years, never makes a mistake because he is also God. And that's why the Trinity and the belief of Trinitism, that Jesus and God are one, is so crucial to Christianity. And that belief is so crucial, is that in order for Jesus' sacrifice to have the meaning that it does to save us through our faith, that Trinity, that nature of him being both fully God and fully man has to be there, right? He can't just be just a human that God created, that he sent to us and ended up being a really good prophet, right? Like we've seen that before. We've had many prophets in the Bible, but this is what makes Jesus very different, is Jesus is fully human and fully God. He's not one or the other. He doesn't have the appearance of one, but it's truly the other. Like he is both. And again, that goes back to the mystery of faith, right? Are we meant to fully understand how that works? I think that is just a concept that a human mind can't wrap themselves around. And so we have that connection. We know that that's how it works. Functionally, how it works, that's going to make it difficult. But again, that's why it's the mystery of faith. There is still some mystery to our faith, and all we can see is the product of it, right? All we can see is what his sacrifice produces. And so that's what allows us to stay convicted in our beliefs, and it has that promise that our faith will eventually pay off and it'll lead to a better life. And of course, there's a promise of saving us from death. And so at the time of his crucifixion, a few things occur. The first one is Jesus is a willing participant, and that makes it very different. A lot of people, obviously crucifixion is one of the most brutal torture and execution methods that history has ever seen. So obviously no one was getting crucified willingly, and no one was like volunteering themselves. And we've seen people volunteer themselves for their family, for their friends. Like we see humans are capable of sacrifice. Jesus is sacrificing himself for everybody. He's sacrificing himself for his enemies. And that's what makes him unique, is he extends his sacrifice and the benefits towards his enemies. And he truly, in this moment, makes a loving act towards his enemies, saying, I know you have hatred for me, but I'm only going to give you love back. And that's what makes it so unique, so difficult, so unbelievably good. It's the ultimate good act that a person can do, is like we can all come to that. I mean, it's difficult for us to have to sacrifice ourselves for our loved ones, but that's something that most people are willing to do, is make a sacrifice for your loved ones. In fact, that's easy for a lot of us to do, right? But to make a sacrifice for your enemies, that is inherently something that we are not wired to be able to do. And so Jesus becomes a willing participant in his own death, and he takes upon himself all the consequences of sin. And what makes him perfect, and what makes him the ultimate, the perfect person to do this, is because he himself has no sin on his conscience, meaning that there's really no justification for this to happen to him, but he's the ultimate pure soul that gets sacrificed for sin, for our sins. And obviously no other human that's ever existed is eligible for this, because we're all sinners. And I forget who said this, but there is a quote out there that says, if life was fair, we'd all be on the cross. Meaning, obviously there's people that are better than others, but and there are genuinely good people, but you, me, everyone listening, everyone that's ever existed, we are all imperfect. We've all sinned. We've all done bad things. We've all fallen short, right? The word sin is actually, it's a I forget if it's a Greek or a Hebrew archery term, right? But the word sin comes from, it was an ancient archery term that meant to miss the mark. You missed the mark. You fell short, right? And we all fall short all the time, except for Jesus. So, of course, John the Baptist prophesizes this when he calls Jesus the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world. And that's why we call him the Lamb. And that sacrifice, his body and blood being sacrificed for us is, I'm recording this on Sunday. I had communion this morning at Sunday Mass. I took communion, and Catholics and Orthodox and many denominations, we consider that Jesus's physical presence coming to us today. Like we can still have that relationship, and he's still sacrificing himself for us, right? Because you can Google all sorts of Eucharistic miracles where the bread actually becomes blood and flesh. They're really cool, but there's an actual physical, supernatural element to the communion that we receive. And so that continues to play a theme in that he is continuing. His body and blood is what is raising us, is what is saving us to try and get to that elevated position, because God created us in his image and we are unique in his creation because of that. The seas, the plants, the animals, the earth itself, these are creations of God, but none of them are in his image. And I'm not a parent, but I could imagine that when you have a child, and every parent that you talk to will say this, is like this, when you have your baby, it's different because I see myself in that child, and that's why I love it so much. And now you can begin to understand the kind of love that God has for us over the rest of his creation, right? Is because he sees himself in us, but we're imperfect. Just like children are imperfect, right? Children make mistakes all the time, but you still continue to love them, right? Even though your child misbehaves and you have to punish them, you have to send them to your room, you still love them. And so now we're starting to understand what Jesus is going through when he just is like, I love you so much that I'm willing to do this. And of course, all of this culminates into the resurrection, which proves the victory over death, because death isn't necessarily, God's enemy ultimately is death. And how is death described? Death is described as eternal separation from God. So what does that look like? I mean, there's obviously some people call that hell. Some people call that what traditionally a secular society would think of death as, is like just this deep sleep that never ends and you never wake up. But that is death. And that's ultimately what Jesus is trying to conquer, because he understands if God's creation, if his children turn away from him, they cannot join him in heaven, right? And they cannot be with him. And now there's a heartbreaking matter that God's children are separated from him for eternity. And that's ultimately what Jesus is trying to defeat. Ultimately sin is the symptom of death. Sin is the symptom of a life lived away from God and a life lived morally corrupted. And so death ultimately becomes the enemy. Death is the ultimate thing that God is trying to defeat with the sacrifice. And so when Jesus resurrects and rises from the dead, that is the announcement that proves his victory over death, because he was, again, fully man who died on the cross and raises himself up after 3 days, saying, it is possible. We have defeated death with this sacrifice. And so again, that is a spiritual element that is so difficult. It's almost like when you're in science class in middle school and you start talking about how big a light year is or how far away a black hole is, and your teacher starts talking about numbers that, okay, I know the numbers, but your brain cannot comprehend billions or trillions or quintillions, like these giant numbers. And so that's kind of what we get in a spiritual sense when we're discussing this crucifixion and the resurrection, right? And what happens there is we know what happens. We know that we're saved, and we can kind of start to understand. We can hear analogies, right, that can kind of make it make sense. But for us to actually understand functionally what happened, that's just something we're unable to get our minds around on earth. So that might be an unsatisfying answer for some people, but the hope is you can see the effects of it and how beneficial having this faith can be in your life, right? And so that's what continues to drive me, to lead me to try and strengthen my relationship. And of course I fall short all the time, but to try and strengthen my relationship with God, because the benefits continue to grow and grow and grow. And leads me to a more fulfilling, happy, loving life, and trying to be the best person that I could possibly be despite all my flaws. And so now we get into the next question of what people will say to me next is how come he can't just save everybody, right? Why is it that, Catholics believe that it's a combination of faith and works? And I think that this can be a bit of a misnomer because critics of the Catholic faith will say that it should just be faith alone. And I think that what we mean by works and faith is you need to be an active participant in trying to build that relationship. Obviously, like, again, I'm going to use the analogy of a family here on earth, right? A relationship between parents and children. If the children just break off the relationship and no longer want to have a relationship with their parents, at some point there's nothing mom and dad can do to bring them back, right? If the kid just excommunicates them and goes away, mom and dad can no longer help them because the kid just keeps rejecting them and pushing them away. And so when someone lives a life without faith and they do bad works, those are, again, symptoms of a life away from God. So it's not, when we say it's faith and works, it's not like there's a checklist, right? There's not an acceptance rate to get into heaven like a college or something where you need this ACT score, you need this GPA, you need these many extracurricular activities. That's not what Catholics are getting at. Because it's never going to be enough, right? It's never enough. There's not anything we can physically do here that is going to be enough to get us into heaven. All that's asked is that we try and participate and try to build that and have a relationship, right? So that we can be under the same house with God instead of just leaving and excommunicating ourselves from God. And then we get into faith versus works. Why can't I just have faith? Why can't I just believe that my parents are my parents or that my wife is my wife, but have no action? And think about how that would work. I use another analogy I like to use is a married couple. And let's say the husband says, my wife is my wife, but he continues to, let's say he's adulterous or he's abusive towards her in some way. And he's just a horrible husband, and nothing he does would give you any indication that he has any love for his wife, right? Is that even a marriage at that point? It's like you can say all you want, but there's actions also matter. And so that's what we get at is like, it's never going to be enough. You're never going to do enough to be a perfect husband or wife. And you're never going to be enough to be a perfect, obedient child of God. But the important thing is that we do our best to participate and try to keep ourselves in God's house and try to do what we can. Yes, as children, we're going to mess up and maybe we'll throw a temper tantrum. Maybe we'll get, and just like children, small children, I mean, even adults, we all make mistakes, right? We all make mistakes. We're all imperfect. But our parents still scoop us up and console us and try to lead us into a better direction. And that is the goal here. And that is the goal of having faith in Jesus. It's like I have faith in my parents. I have faith that my parents will guide me. I have faith that my parents will nurture me. I have faith that my parents are the way to go. Like, this is going to be the best relationship I'll have in my life for growth and development. And so that is what the crucifixion really means to me. That's what the sacrifice means to me. And that's what my faith means to me, is building as much of a faith in Christ as I possibly can. So I hope that answers some questions. I know that's, again, it's so difficult to talk about, and I'm trying my best to word things as well as I can, but I hope you guys are having a wonderful Lent. I know, I don't even know, when's Easter? What's the date today? That's how awful I am. Here we go. We are, so the 5th, we're a couple weeks away from Easter. Good Friday is the 3rd, April 3rd this year. I hope that everyone's Lenten promises are going well. I know mine are going, I gave up social media for Lent. That was one of the things I gave up. So no Instagram, none of that. Because I just feel like doom scrolling was just taking up a lot of my life, and it's giving me more time to contemplate my faith. And I've been coming up with a lot more ideas for this podcast, for the YouTube channel that I hope everyone is going to subscribe to. now that you're listening to this, maybe you're listening to this on YouTube. But anyways, I hope if anyone has any response to this, or they want to make a correction or challenge or anything, if you do it respectfully, of course, that's all I ask. The YouTube comments are open. There's the Discoveries in Faith email address in the description of every episode. And so please, I want to hear from the audience. If anyone has any further questions, any further topics of conversation to cover on the podcast, again, I'm not here to be the be all end all answers for everything. That's that's obviously very difficult to do, but I want to at least start the conversation. That's what this podcast is for. All right. Hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. And until next time, this is Jacob signing out of the Discoveries in Faith podcast.